The relationship between Canada and Germany has changed pretty dramatically during the last 15 years or so. I mean, at that point in the early 2000s, Canada's relations with Germany were mostly through institutions, through NATO. There had been some significant cooperations through NATO in Afghanistan and in the Balkans before that, through the WTO, organizations like that. What we've seen flourish since then, and particularly in recent years, is relations between governments directly. And I would point to two examples as being most important. The negotiation of the Canada-EU trade agreement, which, while officially between Canada and its 10 provinces and 3 territories and the 28 countries of the European Union, in practice, particularly during the latter portion of the negotiations, ended up being something negotiated very much involved with the German government and the Canadian government. It was German officials who were decisive in sort of bringing home the deal to the partner countries. And also I would point to the issues of immigration policy and things like this. There's been an awful lot of high-level interchange between cabinet ministers from both major German political parties over the last decade and high-level people in the Canadian government about how to manage integration, immigration, and I think those forms of political cooperation have deepened in a lot of ways. And I think between those two things, between the new trade environment and the changing political world, where Germany has become a much more similar country in its outlook and political alignment than other traditional Canadian partners, we're starting to see an intensification of that relationship. I think there are important lessons to be learned by both countries from each other. What Germany can learn from Canada is how to be a country of immigration, really. I mean, when I started reporting in Germany, it was standard business for every elected political leader to say, we are not a country of immigration. That was a cliche that everybody had to utter regardless. Now, there's a cross-partisan acknowledgement that immigration is part of the German experience, and to some extent has been for a long time. And what can be learned from the Canadian experience is turning immigrants into citizens very quickly, instantly, ensuring that they do not have an intermediate period where they are migrants or they're people without citizenship, ensuring that they can integrate before they learn the language and these sort of things. That's important. What Canada can learn from Germany is how to invest in immigration, how to the response to the perhaps 1 million people who crossed the border into Germany in 2015 and 2016 was a very organized response by the federal and state governments in Germany to invest in housing, to invest in resources, to invest in institutions of integration, to invest in schooling, to pay for several 100,000 units of housing per year. And Canada can learn from that a generous upfront investment in newcomers and the places where they settle can save a lot of problems down the road. Well, on one hand, you can consider it sort of lucky that nobody wants to have a bureau there because things are calm and not full of conflict. I mean, we don't really want the Cold War to return to the point that everybody has to have a bureau in Berlin. On the other hand, there are a lot of happy reasons why media outlets might want to have a bureau in Berlin. And I think that center of gravity is slowly shifting. Canada will always have a strong media presence in London because of the colonial history, because our head of state lives in London, and so on. But assuming that Brexit continues to be a force in Britain, assuming that the Canada-EU trade agreement and other ties between Canada and the wider European economy intensify, I think we can start to see a period where Berlin is going to become more important. And I think there's beginning to be an acknowledgement in the media that a lot of the things that happen in Europe happen in Berlin, and that it's a useful place to be based. So it wouldn't surprise me to see more Canadian media presence developing in Berlin over the next 10 years. I mean, tourism and academic exchanges and so on are based not always on the most rational calculation, but on certain large images that could be called cliches or stereotypes and so on. Okay. Germans always want to come to Canada because of unspoiled nature and mountains and forests and so on, which is not a bad attraction, really. Canadians, if they travel to Germany, they want to go to Berlin for culture and nightclubs, or they want to go on a cruise on the Rhine, or they want to go to Oktoberfest in Munich or something like that. And I think that's going to be slow to change, really. I think colonial and linguistic histories of countries do define where people go, where they want to go on academic exchanges and so on. The language is a barrier. However, I think a lot of our institutions could learn to make better use of Germany and other European countries, for that matter, for business connections, for academic connections, for connections between cultural institutions and that sort of thing. I think a lot of Canadian institutions don't have the depth of resources to look beyond the countries that they're comfortable with, and there's some real value in engaging with the really robust universities and institutions and cities of Germany for these things. So I think there could be more outreach to develop these links. I think that was a very important symbolic development, and in some senses substantive development on the part of the federal government of Canada to make that ambassador also the envoy to Europe is an acknowledgement on a certain level that the most important engagements with Europe for Canada take place not in Brussels but in Berlin. And I mean that's just a day-to-day fact for diplomats. Canada has 3 embassies in Brussels, but in some ways they've become secondary. Now, the Canadian embassy in Berlin was built in the late 1990s under a very expansive vision of Canadian diplomacy to be a real European hub of cultural diplomacy. The building itself and the structures and institutions within it were meant to really have a strong cultural presence in the center of Europe. And there's been an understanding from the beginning that mission should be an important one in Canada's connection to Europe. But the Canada-EU trade agreement, the changing relationships with Britain, and the intensification of other ties with the broader European economy have meant that the Canadian mission in Berlin has become and will continue to become, I think, very central to our larger European diplomatic and political relations.